Welcome to Whispers of the Night. This is Adam, your host for today's mystery. Today we dive into a story that begins with a funeral, a whisper of superstition, and a mill that seems to remember every wrong ever done beneath its roof. But as always, Poirot reminds us, behind every curse, there lies reason waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this episode, please give this video a like and share it with fellow mystery lovers. And tell me, where are you tuning in from tonight? I always read your comments and truly enjoy hearing from you. Now, pour yourself a cup of coffee, stay curious, and let's get started. Chapter 1. The Grey Afternoon. The train rattled through the Soden countryside, and I found myself studying the raindrops as they traced diagonal paths across the window. Each droplet seemed to hesitate before surrendering to gravity, much as I had hesitated before accepting the invitation to Lower Marling. It was not that I had any reluctance to pay my respects to poor Ned Roden, quite the contrary, but there is something particularly melancholy about attending the funeral of a man one knew in the vigor of youth, a man who had shared the trenches and the camaraderie of those desperate years. You are thinking, mon ami, of your friend. I turned to find Poirot regarding me with that expression of gentle understanding that occasionally softened his usually alert features. His grey cells, as he would say, were never entirely at rest, but he had the grace not to exercise them too vigorously upon his friends. Yes, I admitted, Ned Roden and I served together in France. He was a good fellow, solid, dependable. Not the sort one expects to hear has died in such a fashion. Ah yes, the accident at the mill. Poirot adjusted the angle of his hat upon the seat beside him, for he would never dream of wearing it indoors, even in a railway carriage. You said in your letter that the village speaks of a curse. So I am told. His solicitor mentioned it when he wrote with the daily particulars. Apparently the locals are quite convinced that the old mill is haunted or cursed or some such nonsense. A beam fell and struck poor Rowan on the head. The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death. Poirot's eyebrows rose fractionally. And yet you are troubled, Hastings. Well, it does seem rather a coincidence Roden's father died at the same mill years ago, drowned in the mill race, I believe. Most interesting, murmured Poirot, and I knew that look. The little Belgian detective was intrigued, despite the seemingly straightforward nature of the tragedy. The station at Lower Marling was a modest affair, little more than a wooden platform with a sagging roof that did nothing to keep out the persistent drizzle. A young man in a damp tweed coat met us there, introducing himself as Mr. Fenwick, the local solicitor, who had written to inform me of Roden's death. "Very good of you to come, Captain Hastings," he said, shaking my hand with genuine warmth. "And this is, my friend, Missy Hercule," I supplied. Fenwick's eyes widened with recognition. "The detective, good heavens, I say. We're honored, though I'm afraid there's nothing here to interest you professionally. Tragic accident, pure and simple, though of course the village has its own theories." We climbed into Fenwick's motor car, a somewhat elderly vehicle that coughed and spluttered before consenting to carry us through the village. Lower Marling revealed itself as a place caught between eras. Ancient cottages with sagging thatch roofs stood alongside newer brick constructions, while the church tower loomed grey and Norman against the darker grey of the sky. "The funeral is tomorrow morning," Fenwick explained as we drove. "Mrs. Roden has arranged for you to stay at the Swan Inn. It's simple, but clean. The Roden house is rather full just now with relatives, you understand." "Of course," I said. "How is Mrs. Roden bearing up?" Fenwick's expression grew circumspect as well as can be expected. "She's a delicate creature at the best of times. This has been a terrible shock." We passed the mill itself as we drove, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp afternoon. It was a substantial building of weathered grey stone, 3 stories high, with a great wheel visible at one end. Water rushed beneath it with a sullen roar, and the windows stared blankly like dead eyes. Even in daylight, there was something oppressive about it. "There it is," said Fenwick unnecessarily. "Marling Mill been there 200 years. They say Roden modernized it considerably, put in electric motors and new machinery. Spent a fortune on it, in fact. But the old timbers remained in the storage areas, and that's where it happened." Poirot leaned forward slightly. The beam that fell. It was rotten. Yes. So they said at the inquest. Dry rot, probably. The surveyor mentioned that the whole structure needed attention, but Roden was Fenwick paused delicately. He was not a man to spend money, unnecessarily. I see, said Poirot, and lapsed into silence. The Swan Inn proved to be a comfortable establishment, its low-beam ceiling and crackling fire a welcome refuge from the cheerless afternoon. The landau, a stout woman with shrewd eyes and capable hands, showed us to our rooms with a slightly hushed manner appropriate to visitors attending a funeral. After we had settled in, Poirot and I met in the small parlour for tea. The room was empty, save for ourselves, and I found myself drawn to the window, looking out at the gathering dusk. "You know, Poirot," I said slowly, "I can't help but feel there's something odd about all this. Ned Roden was always careful, meticulous even. It's hard to imagine him walking under a rotten beam without noticing it. And yet, Hastings, men die in accidents every day. The human eye does not always observe what it should." Poirot sipped his tea with evident disapproval. "The English never could make it properly, in his opinion. Tell me more about your friend. What manner of man was he?" I considered this. Brave, certainly. Good officer. But I hesitated, but Poirot prompted gently. He could be hard, not cruel exactly, but unbending. He saw the world in rather black and white terms, right and wrong, duty and dereliction, no room for shades of grey. "Ah," said Poirot, "such men often make enemies without intending to." Before I could respond, voices drifted in from the public bar beyond, a low murmur of conversation, punctuated by the occasional louder remark. "Always said the mill would have its due, and his father, and now him. Mark my words, it's the curse. Shouldn't have cut the wages, not after what happened before." Poirot's eyes met mine, bright with interest. The little detective rose from his chair and moved to stand beside me at the window. Together we looked out at the darkening village where lights were beginning to appear in cottage windows like weary eyes opening in the gloom. The mill itself was barely visible now, a darker mass against the dark sky, but I could still hear the rush of water beneath its wheel. A sound like whispered warnings carried on the autumn wind. Chapter 2. The Funeral and the Legend. The Church of Street. Michael's stood ancient and grey against the morning sky, its Norman tower a testament to centuries of village life and death. The rain had ceased during the night, but the air remained heavy with moisture, and a mist clung to the gravestones like mourning veils. I stood beside Poirot among a considerable gathering. It seemed that Ned Roden, for all his reported sternness, had been a figure of importance in Lower Marling. The villagers had turned out in force, though whether from respect or curiosity I could not immediately determine. The service was simple and dignified. The vicar, an elderly man with a quavering voice, spoke of duty and the uncertainty of mortal life. I found my thoughts drifting to those days in France, when Roden and I had been young men, when death had seemed both terribly close and somehow distant, a thing that happened to others. As we filed out into the churchyard for the interment, I observed the widow for the first time. Margaret Roden was a pale, slender woman of perhaps 30, considerably younger than her husband had been. She wore black that seemed to drain what little colour remained in her face, and she leaned heavily upon the arm of an older woman whom I took to be a relative or companion. There was something frail about Mrs. Roden, something that stirred one's protective instincts. "The housekeeper," murmured Pooh, following my gaze to the older woman. "Mrs. Vale, I believe she's called. You've been making inquiries already, but naturally Hastings, the landlady at the Swan, is most informative. She tells me that Mrs. Vale has been with the Roden family for many years, very devoted to the young mistress." The crowd pressed close around the grave, and I found myself standing near a group of working men whose clothes and bearing marked them as mill hands. They spoke in low voices, but in the quiet of the churchyard their words carried. "Aye, the mill's had its due," said one, a grizzled man with massive shoulders. "Same as it took his father." "Should never have cut the wages," added another. "Not after we'd worked through the bad season. The mill remembers such things." A younger man, handsome despite his work clothes, spoke more quietly. "Tom, you mustn't speak so. Whatever, mister. Roden's faults. This is not the time." "Easy for you to say, Jack Miro," replied the first man. "Tom, apparently you're foreman now, ain't you? Got your rise just before he died." The younger man, Jack Miro, flushed but said nothing more. I caught Pooh's eye and saw that he had heard the exchange as well. His expression remained impassive, but I knew that sharp mind was filing away every detail. After the burial, there was the usual awkward gathering where Moorers paid their respects to the widow. Margaret Roan received condolences with a mechanical grace, her eyes distant. When my turn came, I expressed my sympathy and mentioned my army connection with her late husband. "You are very kind, Captain Hastings," she said in a soft voice. "Edward spoke of you occasionally. He said you were a good man in a tight spot. Your husband was the same, Mrs. Roden. I'm deeply sorry for your loss." She inclined her head, and I moved on, allowing Poirot to offer his own condolences. I noticed that his eyes, usually so bright with interest, held genuine compassion. As we walked back through the village, I became aware that we were being followed. I glanced back to see the elderly mill hand Tom Briggs hurrying to catch up with us. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen," he said, touching his cap, "but you're Captain Hastings, ain't you? Friend of the deceased?" "I am," I confirmed. "And this gentleman?" Tom's eyes fixed on Poirot with an intensity that suggested he already knew the answer. "I am a culpro." The detective Tom nodded slowly. I thought as much. Word travels in a small place like this. He glanced around as though checking for listeners, then leaned closer. "I wonder, sir, if you'd care to hear about the mill, about the curse, like I should be most interested," said Poirot gravely. We repaired to a quiet corner of the Swan's garden, where wooden benches sat beneath a gnarled apple tree. Tom settled himself with the air of a man preparing to tell a tale he'd told many times before. "It were 20 years ago he began that young William, the old miller's son, drowned in the mill race, just a lad. He was barely 16. His father, that would be Edward Roden's father, he'd been cheating the workers something terrible. Short waits on the flour, unpaid wages, and harsh treatment for any who complained. Young William, he tried to stand up for the men, but his father wouldn't hear of it." Tom paused, his weathered face troubled. The night William died, there had been a terrible row. The men had threatened to stop work. Old Rowan swore he'd see them all starved. First William went down to the mill that night. Some say to open the SLL gates and stop the wheel to force his father to negotiate, but he fell or was pushed and the water took him. "Pushed?" I exclaimed. "By whom?" Tom shrugged. "No one knows. His father found him at dawn, tangled in the wheel. They said it were an accident, but folk whispered. And after that things went bad for old Roran. His health failed, his mind wandered. 2 years later he walked into that same mill race one winter night. Whether he jumped or fell, no man can say. And since then," prompted Poirot, "since then the mill's been quiet enough until young Edward Roden took it over. He was like his father in many ways, hard, unforgiving, and when he started cutting wages and threatening the workers," Tom's voice dropped. "Well, sir, I told him myself," I said. "Master, you can't cheat men out of their due and not pay for it. The mill remembers." But he laughed at me, called it superstitious nonsense. "Yet now he is dead," observed Poirot softly. "Aye, sir, dead in the very same mill under a beam that chose that moment to fall after all these years of standing firm." Tom met Poirot's eyes squarely. "You may think what you like, Mr. Poirot, but in Lower Marling we know the truth. The mill protects its own and punishes those who wrong them." He rose heavily and touched his cap once more before walking away, leaving us alone. Beneath the apple tree above us, the bare branches clicked together in the breeze like skeletal fingers counting the dead. Chapter 3. The Scene of Death. After luncheon, I suggested to Poirot that we might take a walk about the village. He agreed with alacrity, and I was not surprised when our steps turned, as if by mutual consent, toward the mill. The building looked less forbidding in daylight, though no less substantial. The great wheel turned steadily, water cascading over its paddles, with a rhythmic splash that had probably echoed through the village for 2 centuries. The modern additions, Electric cables and metal fixtures seemed incongruous against the ancient stone. "It is curious, is it not, Hastings, how the old and new exist together?" Poirot observed. "The mill has been modernized, yet still the water wheel turns, progress and tradition side by side." "Rather like the murder and the curse," I suggested. "Ah, you think it was murder then? Well, don't you? All this talk of curses seems rather convenient." Poirot smiled. "You improved, my friend. Yes, it is most convenient, but let us see what the scene itself can tell us." The main door stood unlocked. Apparently the mill continued to operate despite its owner's death. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of flour and the rumble of machinery. We found ourselves in a large ground-floor room where several workers tended to the equipment. They glanced up at our entrance with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Jack Miro emerged from an inner office, wiping his hands on a cloth. In the better light, I could see he was a well-made fellow of perhaps 28, with an open countenance that inspired confidence. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he inquired politely. Poirot introduced us and explained that I had been a friend of the deceased. Captain Hastings wished to see the place where his comrade met his end. "A matter of paying respects, you understand." Miro's expression softened. "Of course. I'll show you up. Mind the stairs? They're rather steep, and some of the timbers are old." He paused, then added quietly, "That's what did for Mr. Roden. You know, the old timbers." He led us up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where the machinery gave way to storage areas. The ceiling here was lower, supported by massive wooden beams blackened with age. Flour dust covered everything like snow, and our footsteps left clear prints on the floor. "This is where it happened," Miro said, indicating a spot near the far wall. A heavy beam had been propped against the wall, clearly the one that had fallen. Beside it lay a broken lantern, its glass scattered across the boards. Poirot approached slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. He bent to examine the floor, the wall, the beam itself. I watched him work, knowing better than to interrupt. "Mr. Rowan came here often?" Poirot inquired. "Most evenings, sir. He liked to inspect the machinery, check the stores. Very thorough he was." Miro's tone suggested this thoroughness had not been entirely welcome. "And on the night he died, you were here also?" "No, sir. I'd left at 6. The men had all gone home. Mr. Roden came back around 9, as was his habit. Alone. Always alone for his evening rounds. He preferred it that way." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And the beam? It simply fell. So it seems, sir, the timber was rotten through. You can see where it gave way." Miro pointed to the broken end of the beam. But Poirot was examining something else. He had moved to where a walking stick leaned against the wall some distance from where the beam had fallen. "This belonged to Mr. Roden." "Yes, sir. He always carried it. Bad knee from the war, I believe. Yet it is here, not where he fell." Miro looked puzzled. "I suppose he must have set it down before walking into the area where the beam would fall." Poirot's tone was mild, but I heard the skepticism beneath it. Why would a man with a bad knee set aside his walking stick to traverse a dangerous floor? I couldn't say, sir. Miro's expression had become guarded. Poirot said nothing more, but continued his examination. He studied the beam minutely, running his fingers along its length. At one point he paused, producing a small magnifying glass from his pocket. He never travelled without it, and examining something with great attention. "Most interesting," he murmured. "What is it, Poirot?" I asked. He straightened. "Perhaps nothing, Hastings. Perhaps everything. Tell me, Mr. Miro, has anyone touched this beam since the accident?" The constable examined it, sir, and the coroner, and of course we had to move it aside so the men could work safely, but otherwise no. "And the lantern? It was Mr. Rawdon's?" "Yes, sir. He always brought one for the evening inspection, even though we have electric lights now. Old habits, I suppose." We descended the stairs a few minutes later. Poirot remained silent, his brow furrowed in thought. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the mill yard. "What did you see, Poirot?" I demanded as soon as we were out of earshot. Sal mon ami. First, as you yourself observed, the walking stick. A man does not carefully place his stick at a distance when he intends to walk only a few steps. Perhaps he stumbled and it fell from his hand. Then why is it leaning so neatly against the wall? No, Hastings, it was placed there deliberately, but not, I think, by Roden himself. By whom, then? That is the question. And there is something else. Marks upon the beam where it broke. Fresh marks, Hastings, made by a saw or some similar tool, hidden beneath the flour dust, but present nonetheless. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the automare. You mean, my friend, that this beam did not simply fall from natural decay. It was encouraged to fall. And there is one more thing that troubles me greatly. What's that? Poirot's face was grave as we walked away from the mill back toward the village proper. The lantern was broken. Yes, yet the oil from it had soaked into the floorboards. But Hastings, if a man is struck on the head by a falling beam, does he not drop what he is carrying immediately? The lantern should have fallen away from the body, not beneath it where the oil would spread. Unless someone placed it there afterward, I said slowly. Precisimo, someone who wished to make the scene appear as an accident should appear. But who, Hastings? And more importantly, why? The mill continued its steady turning behind us, the water rushing beneath it with a sound like whispered secrets, as the lengthening shadows crept across the village like the dark fingers of an approaching truth. Chapter 4. Secrets and Accounts. The following morning found us in the cramped office of Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor. Poirot had requested to see the mill accounts, citing a desire to understand the financial situation that might have contributed to the tragedy. Fenwick had been reluctant at first, but Poirot's reputation and gentle persistence had won the day. I must emphasize that these are confidential documents, Fenwick said, spreading several ledgers across his desk, though I suppose with poor Rowan dead, the harm in showing them is minimal. You are most kind, said Poirot, settling his spectacles upon his nose. I assure you, discretion is of the utmost importance to Hercule Poirot. I watched as my friend pored over the columns of figures, occasionally making a small note in his pocketbook. To me, the accounts looked straightforward enough. Entries for wages, materials, sales of flour, but Poirot's brow furrowed with increasing interest. These payments here, he said at length, pointing to a series of entries marked J.M. What are they for? Fenwick leaned forward to look. Ah, yes. Consultancy fees. I believe Roden hired Jack Miro, that's the current foreman, to do various improvements to the machinery. Miro is quite talented with mechanical matters. The amounts are considerable, observed. Roden was tight-fisted about most things, but he recognized value when he saw it. Mayo saved him a good deal of money by repairing equipment himself rather than hiring specialists from London. Poirot nodded slowly, but I could see he was not entirely satisfied. He continued his examination, occasionally asking Fenwick to clarify an entry. When we finally left, more than an hour had passed. What did you make of it, Poirot? I asked as we walked back toward the Swan. I made of it, Hastings, that there are certain inconsistencies. Several wage entries have been crossed out and rewritten. The amounts paid to workers do not quite match what Tom Briggs and others claim they were owed. And these consultancy fees, they are very convenient, are they not? Payments made in cash, with no detailed invoicing. You think Miro was stealing? I think, mon ami, that someone was being very clever with the accounts. Whether it was Miro or another, I cannot yet say. Our conversation was interrupted by the appearance of Mrs. Vale, the housekeeper, hurrying along the lane toward us. Her face was flushed with exertion. "Mr. Poirot," she called, "might I have a word?" We stopped, and she approached with evident relief. She was a sturdy woman of perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair, and a face that suggested both strength and kindness. "Forgive me for accosting you on the street," she said breathlessly. "But I couldn't come to the inn. It wouldn't be proper, and I felt I must speak to someone about poor Mrs. Roden." "Is she unwell?" I asked with concern. "In body? No, but in spirit." Mrs. Vale's lips tightened. "She's troubled, gentlemen. Very troubled. She barely sleeps, barely eats, and she keeps asking about the mill, wanting to know exactly how it happened. That is natural, surely. said Poirot gently. A widow wishes to understand her husband's death. Yes, but Mrs. Vale hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. Mr. Poirot, you're a man of the world. You must have seen much of human nature. I've been with the Rodons since before the marriage, and I know what I saw. Mr. Roden was not an easy man. He had a hard tongue, especially with his wife. He could be cruel, sir, in small ways that leave no mark, but hurt just the same. You are suggesting the marriage was unhappy. I'm suggesting nothing, Mrs. Vale said firmly. I'm simply telling you what is. Mrs. Roden is young, too young to have been tied to a man like that, and now she's free, and she's frightened. And I don't know if it's grief or guilt or what it is, but something troubles her terribly. Poor regarded her thoughtfully. You have been with the family long, madam. You knew Mr. Rodon's father also. I did, sir. And I'll tell you plain, the son was no better than the father. Both hard men, both unfair to those who worked for them. The old man died in that mill, and now the son. Some call it a curse, but I call it the hand of Providence. Yet you remain loyal to Mrs. Roden. Mrs. Vale's expression softened. She's a good woman, sir. Whatever happened, whatever she may have done or not done, she's a good woman at heart. I just wanted someone to know that. She hurried away before we could question her further, leaving us standing in the lane with more questions than answers. That afternoon, I accompanied Poirot on what I thought would be a casual walk along the river. Instead, we found ourselves approaching the mill from the far side, where a narrow path followed the mill race. Here, Jack Miro stood speaking with Margaret Rowan. They stood close together, their conversation clearly intimate. Mrs. Roden's black dress was stark, against the grey-green landscape, and even from a distance I could see the animation in her face as she spoke. Me listened intently, occasionally reaching out as if to touch her arm, though he never quite completed the gesture. We were too far away to hear their words, but the tableau spoke volumes. When Miro finally turned to go back to the mill, Mrs. Roden remained by the water, staring down at the rushing current with an expression I could not read. "Come, Hastings," Pooh murmured. "Let us continue our walk. But shouldn't we? We should observe Monami, and we should think. That is all." As we walked, I could not help but voice my thoughts. It looks rather damning, doesn't it? The young widow and the handsome foreman. If they were involved before Roden's death, then we have motive. Poirot finished. Yes, Hastings. We have motive, and we have opportunity. Jack Miro was familiar with the mill, with its structure, with the habits of his employer. And if he was also stealing from the accounts, he had double reason to wish Roden dead. And Mrs. Broaden. Ah, the wife. She gains the mill, she gains freedom, and perhaps she gains also the man she loves. It is, as you say, rather damning. We had reached the village green, where several locals sat on benches, enjoying the pale sunshine. Among them was Tom Briggs, smoking a pipe and watching the world pass by. When he saw us, he touched his cap, but did not rise. "You've been to see the mill again, I take it," he said. It was not a question. "We have indeed," Poirot replied. "Tell me, Mr. Briggs, you have worked there many years. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the accounts? Any discrepancies?" Tom's weathered face became guarded. "I'm not a man for figures, Mr. Poirot. I do my work and take my wages. But if those wages were less than they should have been, then I'd not be the first working man to be cheated, nor the last." Tom drew on his pipe. "But I'll tell you this much. Whatever went on in that office, Mr. Roden knew about it. Nothing happened in that mill without his knowledge. If someone was playing games with the books, he was in on it, or he knew and let it happen. Why would he do such a thing?" Tom shrugged. Maybe he needed someone else to do the dirty work. Or maybe he was being blackmailed to keep quiet. Who can say? The dead keep their secrets, Mr. Poirot. As we walked back to the Swan, the sun was setting behind the mill, casting its long shadow across the village. The wheel continued to turn, patient and inexorable, and I found myself thinking of Mrs. Vale's words about Providence and Tom's words about secrets and the image of Jack Miro and Margaret Roden standing together by the water. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but the picture they formed was still unclear, obscured by shadows and whispered legends, and the steady rhythmic splash of water over an ancient wheel. Chapter 5. The Tea and the Trap. It was over breakfast the next morning that Poirot announced his intention to call upon the local doctor. "But why Poirot?" I asked, somewhat bewildered. "You're not unwell, surely?" "No, mon ami. I am in excellent health, but I wish to discuss the late Mr. Roden's health with Dr. Cartwright. There are certain questions that trouble me." "Doctor?" The Cartwright proved to be a brisk, efficient man of middle years who received us in his surgery with professional courtesy. When Poirot explained his interest in the case, the doctor's manner became more reserved. "I'm not sure what I can tell you that wasn't covered at the inquest. Mr. Poirot, Edward Roden died from a blow to the head, consistent with being struck by the falling beam. There was no evidence of foul play, and his general health before the accident. Robust enough for a man of his age. He'd seen me a few times for his knee, old war injury, but nothing serious, sound heart, good constitution, no dizziness, no weakness, none that he reported." Dr. Cartwright paused. "Why do you ask?" Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Because, doctor, I wonder how such a careful man came to be struck by a falling beam. Surely he would have heard it giving way, seen it falling. Yet, by all accounts, he made no attempt to move clear." The doctor frowned. "I suppose his reflexes might have been slow. He was in his 50 seconds after all. Or perhaps his reflexes were slower than usual for another reason," Poirot suggested delicately. "Tell me, doctor, did you examine the contents of Mr. Roden's stomach? There was no need for a full post-mortem. The cause of death was obvious. But if there had been, what might you have looked for?" Dr. Cartwright's expression shifted from reserve to interest. "Are you suggesting he was poisoned?" "Not poisoned, no, but perhaps slowed, made less alert. There are substances, are there not, that might produce such an effect? Certainly, various sedatives, sleeping draughts, laudanum, chloral hydrate, even a strong dose of certain herbs." The doctor paused, but there was no reason to suspect. "There is now," said Poirot quietly. "I ask you to think back, doctor. When you examined the body, was there anything at all that struck you as unusual, even a small detail?" "Doctor." Cartwright was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Finally he said, "Now that you mention it, there was something. His pupils were rather dilated. I noted it at the time, but assumed it was due to the trauma of death. But if he had taken a sedative beforehand and the scene of death, was there a cup or glass nearby? I don't recall the constable would have noted such things in his report." After leaving the surgery, Poirot was in thoughtful mood. We walked slowly through the village, and I could practically hear the machinery of his little grey cells at work. "Poirot," I said at length, "what are you thinking?" "I am thinking, Hastings, about the ritual of the evening inspection. Tom Briggs mentioned that Mr. Roden went to the mill each evening, but what did he do before he went? There must have been some routine, some habit. I suppose he might have had dinner first, and perhaps a cup of tea afterward, as is the English custom. Let us visit Mrs. Vale again, shall we?" We found the housekeeper at the Roden residence, a substantial stone house on the edge of the village. She admitted us to a comfortable morning room, where Margaret Roden sat by the window, a piece of needlework lying forgotten in her lap. She looked even more pale and drawn than at the funeral. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said quietly. "This is unexpected." "Forgive the intrusion, madam," Poirot said with a small bow. "I wonder if I might trouble you with a few questions about your late husband's habits." She gestured for us to sit, though she seemed tense. Mrs. Vale remained standing by the door, her face impassive. "What habits do you wish to know about his evening routine? Before he went to the mill for his inspection, what did he typically do?" Margaret's hands twisted together in her lap. "He took dinner at 7. Then he would sit in his study for half an hour, going over papers. Mrs. Vale would bring him tea at 8, and he would drink it while he finished his work. Then at 8 or thereabouts he would go to the mill, and on the night he died, the same as always. Everything was exactly the same." But her voice trembled as she said it, and Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing. "Mrs. Vale," he said, turning to the housekeeper. "You prepared the tea that evening?" "I did, sir, as always, strong and black, just as Mr. Roden liked it." "And you brought it to him yourself?" Mrs. Vale hesitated. "No, sir. That evening Mrs. Roden took it to him. I was occupied with the washing up." All eyes turned to Margaret. She had gone very white. "Yes, I brought him his tea. There was nothing unusual about it. Mrs. Vale had prepared it as always, and you did not add anything to it. No sugar, no milk." Edward took his tea plain. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Pooh nodded gently. "Thank you, madame. You have been most helpful." He rose to leave, then paused as if struck by an afterthought. "One more small thing, the teapot and cup from that evening. Do you still have them?" Mrs. Vale spoke up. "I washed them the next morning, sir, as is proper, though." She hesitated. "Yes. There was something odd about the tea leaves when I emptied the pot. They had a queer smell to them. Not quite right, but I thought perhaps the tea had simply gone stale. After we left the house, I burst out. 'Good Lord, Poirot, you think she drugged him?' I think, mon ami, that someone wished Mr. Roden to be slower, less alert when he went to the mill that night. Whether it was Mrs. Roden herself, or whether she was merely the unwitting instrument of another, remains to be seen." We walked toward the mill, and Poirot insisted on making another examination of the scene. This time he focused on details I had not noticed before. The pattern of flour dust on the floor, the exact position of various tools and equipment, the sight lines from different positions in the room. "You see, Hastings, this was carefully planned. The beam was weakened in advance, yes, but not so much that it would fall of its own accord. It needed a trigger. Perhaps the vibration of footsteps, perhaps deliberate push, and the timing had to be exact. Roden had to be beneath it at precisely the right moment. But how could anyone ensure that? Ah, that is the question. Unless, Pooh's eyes narrowed, unless someone was here to guide him to the spot, to call to him perhaps, or to place something there that would draw his attention. He pointed to the wall where Roden's walking stick had been found. The stick was placed there deliberately. I am certain of it. But why? Unless it served to mark the spot to show someone where Roden would stand. You mean Miro? Miro had the opportunity. Certainly, he knew the mill intimately. He could have weakened the beam over several days, removing a little wood each time, making it appear to be natural decay. And on the night of the, quote, death, he could have been here waiting in the shadows. But Tom Briggs said the mill wheel was turning that night. Surely the noise would have covered any sound of movement. Exactly so, Hastings. The wheel provides both opportunity and concealment. A man could move about the upper floor quite freely, while the machinery below drowned out all sound. We stood in the dim storage area, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. The afternoon light slanted through the dusty windows, illuminating mows of flour dust that drifted in the air like snow. I thought of Ned Roden moving through this same space on his last evening alive, perhaps feeling the drowsiness of the drugged tea, unaware that death waited in the shadows above. "It's a devil of a thing, Poirot," I said quietly. "To plan a murder so carefully to use a man's own habits against him." "Yes, my friend. But the devil, as they say, is in the details, and it is the details that will hang the murderer." The wheel continued its eternal turning. Outside, and somewhere in the village, a church bell tolled the hour with solemn finality. Chapter 6. The Gathering. Poirot arranged the meeting with the methodical care he brought to all his affairs. The drawing-room of the Roden house was chosen as the venue, and invitations were issued, though in truth they were commands that none could refuse. The local inspector, a sensible man named Davies, had been persuaded to attend, though he remained skeptical of Poirot's theories. I arrived early to find the room already prepared. The curtains had been drawn back to admit the grey afternoon light, and chairs had been arranged in a semicircle facing the fireplace, where Poirot would stand to deliver his explanation. It was a theatrical arrangement, but then Poirot had always understood the value of theatre in the revelation of truth. They came one by one. Tom Briggs, still in his working clothes, looked uncomfortable in the fine room. Jack Miro entered with his usual easy confidence, though I thought I detected a weariness in his eyes. Mrs. Vale took a seat near the door, her hands folded in her lap. Dr. Cartwright came, and Mr. Fenwick, the solicitor, both curious about what Poirot had discovered. Finally, Margaret Roden descended the stairs, pale as a ghost in her black dress. She moved like a woman in a dream or perhaps a nightmare, and took the chair Mrs. Vale had saved for her. When all were assembled, Poirot took his position before the fireplace. He looked at each person in turn, his green eyes sharp and penetrating. "Madame Monsieur," he began, "I have asked you here today because a great injustice has been done, not to the dead, for the dead are beyond our help, but to truth itself. The death of Edward Rodden was not an accident, nor was it the work of any supernatural curse. It was murder carefully planned and coldly executed." A murmur ran through the room. Margaret gave a small gasp, and Mrs. Vale reached over to steady her, but Mr. Poirot, Inspector Davies, objected. The inquest clearly established. The inquest established what it was meant to establish. Poirot interrupted gently. "That is the brilliance of this crime, you understand. The murderer created a scene that appeared to be exactly what everyone expected, an accident at a cursed mill. The village believed it because they wanted to believe it. The authorities believed it because there was no obvious evidence to the contrary." He began to pace slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "But let us examine what really happened on that night." Edward Roden followed his usual routine. He took dinner, then retired to his study with his papers. At 8, his wife brought him his tea, strong and black, as he preferred it. But this tea contained something extra, a sedative, perhaps laudanum, enough to slow his reflexes and dull his awareness. "That's absurd." Jack Miro's voice rang out. Mrs. Roden would never. "Please, Mr. Miro, do not interrupt. All will become clear." Poirot's tone was firm. The drugged tea was drunk. Mr. Rowan, feeling perhaps slightly drowsy, but attributing it to a long day, went to the mill, as was his habit. He carried his lantern and his walking stick. He climbed the stairs to the storage floor, where he went most evenings to inspect the stores. Poirot paused, letting the tension build. But on this night, someone was waiting for him, someone who knew he would come, who knew exactly where he would walk, who had prepared the scene with meticulous care. Over several days, perhaps weeks, this person had gradually weakened one of the overhead beams. Not obviously. That would have aroused suspicion. No, the cuts were hidden, disguised to appear as natural decay. The beam was weakened just enough that it would fall under the right circumstances. "The curse," Tom Briggs muttered. "I told you the mill did nothing, monsieur, except exist as a convenient excuse. The killer used the legend of the curse as camouflage for murder." Poirot turned his penetrating gaze on Jack Marrow. And who better to execute such a plan than the mill's foreman, a man who knew every beam, every board, every corner of the building, a man who had legitimate reason to be there at any hour. Miro had gone very pale. "You can't prove anything. Can I not? Let us continue." Mr. Roden arrives at the mill, slightly befuddled by the drug. He climbs to the storage floor. "Perhaps you call to him, Mr. Merrill? Or perhaps you have placed something to draw his attention. A tool out of place, a box that should not be there. He moves to investigate, and you suggest he place his walking stick aside so he can use both hands. He stands beneath the weakened beam." Poirot's voice dropped lower. "And then you push, not the man. No, that would leave marks, create struggle. You push a heavy sack, perhaps, or you use a lever against the beam itself. It falls, and Edward Roden falls with it, struck down before his drugged reflexes can save him. You drop his lantern near the body to complete the scene. You place the body, walking stick carefully against the wall, too carefully as it happens, and then you slip away into the night while the mill wheel drowns out any sound. This is fantasy." Mayo burst out, half rising from his chair. "You have no proof, no evidence, do I not? I have the saw marks on the beam, hidden but present. I have the drugged tea. Mrs. Vale herself noticed the strange smell. I have the walking stick placed where no man would put it if he were walking naturally. And I have something else, Mr. Miro. I have your motive." Poirot produced a small notebook from his pocket. "You were stealing from the mill, were you not? Those consultancy fees, so convenient, so difficult to trace." But Mr. Roden had begun to suspect. He was examining the accounts more carefully. Soon he would have discovered your theft, and then you would have faced ruin, dismissal, prosecution, perhaps prison. But there was another motive, was there not? A stronger one, perhaps. Poirot turned to Margaret Roden, who sat frozen in her chair. "You loved her, and she perhaps had some feeling for you. You told her how cruel her husband was, how she deserved better. You painted pictures of a life together once she was free and the mill was hers. Did you not, Mr. Mero?" He said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. "And you, madame," Poirot said gently to Margaret, "you were unhappy. Your husband was hard, perhaps cruel. This young man offered sympathy, offered hope. When he suggested that your husband take something to help him sleep, just a little powder in his tea, nothing harmful, did you question it? Or did you tell yourself it was just to make your husband more peaceful, more kind?" Margaret's face crumpled. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know what he meant to do. Jack said it would just make Edward drowsy, that he wouldn't be so harsh with the workers. I never thought. You never thought he meant to kill him." Poirot finished. "Perhaps that is true. Perhaps you closed your eyes to what you suspected, because you wanted so badly to believe in the dream Mr. Mero offered you. But ignorance, madame, is not innocence." Inspector Davies had risen to his feet. "Jack Mero, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Edward Roan." Mero stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "He deserved it," he said in a low voice. "He was a tyrant, a cheat. He made everyone's life miserable. The village is better off without him." "Perhaps," said Poirot quietly, "but that was not your decision to make. You are not Providence, Mr. Marrow, nor are you the mill's curse. You are simply a man who chose murder over honesty, and who used a woman's unhappiness as a tool for your own ends." As the inspector led me away, Margaret remained seated, weeping silently into her hands. "Mrs." Vale moved to comfort her, but there was a sadness in the housekeeper's face that spoke of disappointment rather than surprise. We left them there and walked out into the gathering dusk. The mill stood dark against the promenade sky, its wheels still turning with patient indifference. The curse, it seemed, had been nothing more than a convenient fiction, but the human capacity for betrayal and murder was real enough. Poirot stopped at the edge of the property and looked back at the house, where lamplight now glowed in the windows. "It is done, Hastings," he said quietly. "Justice has been served after a fashion, though I wonder if justice truly exists in such cases. A cruel man is dead, a weak woman has been made weaker, and a clever young man has destroyed himself through ambition and greed. At least the truth is known," I offered. "Yes, mon ami, the truth is known, and perhaps that must be enough." We walked back through the village as night fell, and behind us the mill wheel turned on, grinding out its endless rhythm, indifferent to the small tragedies of mortal men. Epilogue: the human heart. 3 weeks had passed since Jack Mero's arrest, and Poirot and I were preparing to return to London. The case had been concluded to the satisfaction of the law, though not perhaps to the satisfaction of anyone's conscience. I stood at the window of our room at the Swan, looking out at the village that had become so familiar. The autumn had deepened into something approaching winter, and the trees stood bare against a pale sky. From this vantage point I could just see the mill, its wheels still turning with the same patient rhythm it had maintained for 2 centuries. "You are pensive, mon ami," Poirot observed from his chair by the fire. He had been reading the morning paper, but now he set it aside and regarded me with that expression of gentle inquiry that invited confidences. "I was thinking about Margaret Rowan," I admitted. "What will become of her?" "Ah, yes, the unfortunate Mrs. Roden." Poirot steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "The law has been merciful in its way. She will not face prosecution. The evidence suggests she did not knowingly participate in murder. But mercy does not erase guilt, Hastings. She will carry that burden for the rest of her life. She was a victim too, in a sense, trapped in an unhappy marriage, manipulated by me. Was she? Poirot's tone was thoughtful rather than challenging. Or did she allow herself to be manipulated because it suited her purposes? That is the question that troubles me most about this case. Where does weakness end and culpability begin? I turned from the window to face him. You think she knew more than she admitted? I think, Hastings, that the human heart is very skilled at deceiving itself. Margaret Rowan wanted to believe that the powder she put in her husband's tea was harmless. She wanted to believe that Jack Miro loved her for herself, not for the mill she would inherit. She wanted to believe that her unhappiness justified any action, any compromise. And so she closed her eyes to what a more honest woman would have seen. That's rather harsh, Poirot, is it? Consider she brought the drugged tea to her husband on the very night he would die. She had been meeting secretly with Jack Miro for weeks. She knew her husband had been examining the accounts and suspected theft. She knew Jack had access to the mill at all hours. Did all these facts truly escape her notice, or did she simply choose not to connect them? I had no answer to that. After a moment, Poirot continued, his voice softer. But you are right, mon ami. She was also a victim, not of Jack Miro alone, but of her own weakness, her own fear. That is what makes this case so sad. There are no true villains here, only flawed human beings who made terrible choices. Surely Miro is a villain, I protested. He planned a cold-blooded murder. Did he plan it, though? Or did it evolve gradually in his mind, one small step leading to another? First, perhaps he stole a little from the accounts. Nothing serious, just what he felt he deserved. Then Mr. Roden began to suspect, and Jack realized he would be caught. So he befriended the unhappy wife, offering sympathy that grew into something more calculated. He weakened the beam, perhaps at first, just to create a problem he could then solve, to make himself indispensable. And then one night, with Roden drugged and vulnerable, the final step seemed almost inevitable. You're saying he didn't intend it from the beginning. I am saying that murder is often not a single decision but a series of small compromises, each one making the next easier to justify. Jack Miro convinced himself that Roden was a tyrant who deserved his fate. He convinced himself that he was acting for Margaret's happiness as well as his own. He hid behind the legend of the curse, telling himself that fate had chosen this path. But in the end, Hastings, these were all lies. Lies he told himself to make murder acceptable. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Vale entered, her expression grave. Begging your pardon, Mr. Poirot, but I wanted to thank you before you left and to give you this. She held out a sealed envelope from Mrs. Roden. She asked me to deliver it. Poirot took the envelope with a small bow. How is Mrs. Roden? Bearing up, sir, as she must. She's decided to sell the mill. Can't bear to keep it now. She'll move away. Start fresh somewhere no one knows her story. Mrs. Vale's face was troubled. I'll go with her, of course. She'll need someone. You are loyal, madame. She's not a bad woman, Mr. Poirot. Just a weak one who fell under the wrong influence. We all make mistakes, don't we? The question is whether we learned from them. After she had gone, Poirot opened the envelope and read the letter within. His expression was sad as he passed it to me. The handwriting was elegant but shaky. Dear Mr. Poirot, I know you must think very poorly of me. I think very poorly of myself. You were right when you said that ignorance is not innocence. I did not want to see what Jack was planning, but perhaps in my heart I knew I wanted to be free so desperately that I closed my eyes to the price of that freedom. Edward was not kind to me, but he did not deserve to die. No one deserves that. I will live with this knowledge for the rest of my days, and perhaps that is my punishment. Thank you for finding the truth, even though it has broken what little peace I had. Truth is better than the lies I was telling myself. Margaret Roden. I folded the letter and returned it to Poirot, feeling a weight in my chest. Poor woman. Yes, Hastings, but also poor Roden, and even in a way poor Jack Miro, for he destroyed himself as surely as he destroyed his victim. We finished our packing in silence. As we prepared to leave, I took one last look out the window at the mill. A small group of workers was arriving for the day shift, and I saw Tom Briggs among them, still wearing his cap at the same jaunty angle. What will happen to the mill? I asked. It will be sold, operated by new owners, and eventually the story will fade into legend. Years from now, villagers will still speak of the curse, but they will forget the real names, the real tragedies. The mill will outlast us all, Hastings. It does not care about human folly. As we walked to the station, Poirot was unusually quiet. Only when we were settled in our railway carriage, watching Lower Marling recede into the distance, did he speak again. You know, Manami, what troubles me most about this case is not the murder itself, terrible though it was, but the way everyone conspired in their own deception. The villagers wanted to believe in the curse because it was easier than confronting the reality of murder. Margaret wanted to believe in Jack's love because it offered escape. Jack wanted to believe that Roden deserved death because it justified his actions. Even Roden himself perhaps believed that his harshness was merely strength, his cruelty merely firmness. What are you saying, Poirot? He turned from the window to look at me, his green eyes serious. I am saying, Hastings, that the curse of the old mill was not supernatural. It was the curse that afflicts all humanity, the curse of self-deception, of choosing comfortable lies over difficult truths. That is the real danger, mon ami. Not ghosts or legends, but the stories we tell ourselves to justify what we know in our hearts to be wrong. The train carried us through the grey countryside, away from Lower Marling and its tragedies, but Poirot's words stayed with me long after. Perhaps they always would. For in the end, the greatest mystery is not who committed the crime, but how ordinary people no different from ourselves, come to commit it. And the most important truth is not who is guilty, but that we all carry within us the capacity for both great good and terrible evil. The question is not whether we will be tempted, but whether we will have the courage to face the truth about ourselves when that temptation comes. That, I thought, was the real lesson of the curse of the old mill. Thank you for listening to The Curse of the Old Mill. Here on Whispers of the Night, Poirot reminds us that not all curses are born of legend. Some begin in the human heart where pride and deception turn truth into tragedy. If you enjoyed this mystery, please subscribe for more detective tales and share it with fellow lovers of intrigue. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Adam, signing off from Whispers of the Night.